This is episode 12, primary auxiliary verbs and modal auxiliary verbs. Now in the previous video we focused on the differences between auxiliary and lexical verbs, and I didn't really want to get sidetracked from the lexical auxiliary distinction, but auxiliary verbs can be further broken down into primary auxiliary verbs and modal auxiliary verbs, and that's what we'll be exploring further today. So the whole verb structure can be represented in the following table. Firstly, we have verbs. These verbs can be broken down into lexical verbs and auxiliary verbs. And these lexical and these auxiliary verbs can be further broken down into primary auxiliary verbs and modal auxiliary verbs. So we'll begin now by talking about the modal auxiliary verb. Now I mentioned in the last video the modal verb tells us how plausible or likely a sentence is. So we'll write here plausibility. So we'll consider the following sentences. I will catch up with my friend next week versus I might catch up with my friend next week. In these two sentences, we have modal auxiliaries will and might. And just from our knowledge of English, we know that the first sentence is much more likely to occur than the second sentence. So here the first sentence is a more confident message, and that is because of the word will. And the second sentence is a less confident message, and that's because of the word might. And that's what we mean by plausibility or being plausible. So we'll bring back the table here. And we'll write down we mentioned what the modal verbs were in the last video, but I'm going to write them down again now. So the modal verbs are will, would, can, could, may, might, shall, should, must, and have to. And have to is a complex verb there with the two parts, but it's still modal auxiliary. Now there is some ambiguity with some of these modal verbs that can express both likelihood, but they can also express ability or even getting permission. So can and could and may are examples where ambiguity can exist, and interlocutors rely on context to make meaning. And what I mean by interlocutors are the people who are doing the speaking and listening, the ones having the interaction. So we'll get a blank piece of paper here and we'll write down the sentence, she may not eat her vegetables. Now, does this sentence mean that it is unlikely that she will eat her vegetables? She may not eat her vegetables. Alternatively, does it mean that she is not allowed to eat her vegetables? Now we know from context that the chances of it being the second are very small, but it's still a possibility. She's not allowed to eat her vegetables, she may not eat her vegetables. She's unlikely to eat her vegetables, she may not eat her vegetables. It's just based on context. Let's try another one. He can stay up until midnight. So does this mean he is able to stay up until midnight? Or does it mean that he has been granted permission to do so? So only context can make this clear for us. All right, let's bring back this table once again. That's the modal auxiliary verbs, but now we can look again now at the primary auxiliary verbs. Be, have and do are the three primary auxiliary verbs, or dummy do as it's often referred to, because it only comes out when it's needed for its functional purpose, and we don't often see it otherwise. For example, I like spaghetti, but when we ask the question, we don't say like you spaghetti, we need our auxiliary do you like spaghetti. And so therefore do is a functional, like be and have as well. They play a purely functional role, they carry no content at all. So just like I mentioned with my example, do you like spaghetti? These functional primary auxiliary verbs are able and enable us to ask questions. They enable us to create emphasis, or to reveal the time in which events occur and how we relate to these events based on when we're speaking. They have lots of wonderful functions like that, and I'm not going to go into detail now about that, but we will down the track. But we do need to know that they are purely functional roles that these primary auxiliaries have. So when we talk about auxiliary verbs, we are talking about verbs that play a functional role in the sentence, and they can be divided into primary auxiliaries, be, have and dummy do, and modal auxiliary verbs, and those verbs that tell us the likelihood of something occurring, the plausibility of these things. Now that we're familiar with the two different types of auxiliary verbs, we can now look at the similarities between lexical verbs and auxiliary verbs, so that we can understand why it is that they might be considered to be in the same word class. So until then, thanks for watching The Language Code.